The night air smelled like salt and money. Marcus Webb had noticed that about places like this, the kind of wealth that sat on a coastline didn't bother to hide itself. It let the ocean do the talking. Ashford Grand Estate stretched across 14 acres of Main Headland, its white stone facade lit gold against the October dark. Its manicured hedges trimmed to the kind of precision that required a full-time staff just to maintain the illusion that it had all grown that way naturally. The driveway alone was a quarter-mile of crushed white gravel that crunched under his tires with a sound he associated, now that he thought about it, with his childhood understanding of what rich was supposed to look like. Something he'd formed from movies and then never quite updated, because the reality of wealth when you actually moved near it was stranger and more specific than movies had suggested. He had parked his truck, a 2009 Dodge, one rear panel a slightly different shade of white from the repair he'd made in June, using a paint match that was close, but not quite, at the far end of the service lot, as directed. Third row back, between a catering van and an equipment trailer. He didn't mind. He had long since stopped minding things like that. In the cab beside him, Lily was asleep. She'd made it to exit 14 before her eyes had closed, her cheek pressed against the window, her science fair permission slip-clutched in one small hand. She was 8 years old, and she slept the way all children sleep when they trust completely, without reservation, without armor, her mouth slightly open, and her breath fogging the glass in little clouds that appeared and disappeared like thoughts. He had watched her sleep more times than he could count. In the hospital, after she was born, when she'd been 4 pounds 11 ounces and new to the world, and he'd sat beside the incubator for 19 straight hours because he hadn't known how to do anything else. In the car, at her grandmother's, at rest stops on road trips they'd taken to see the places Elena had always wanted to see, and that Marcus had resolved, after, to take Lily to anyway. On the couch on Sunday mornings when cartoons were supposed to be keeping her awake, but hadn't. She was his daughter in every way a person could be someone's daughter. Marcus looked at her for a long moment before he got out. He was 39. He didn't think about that number often, but sometimes it ambushed him, usually in moments like this one, quiet moments at the edges of other people's louder lives. 39. He had friends from college who were vice presidents now. One of them had been profiled in Forbes. The piece had a photograph of him standing in front of a glass and steel building in a way that suggested he'd been born standing in front of glass and steel buildings. 2 had appeared, briefly, on CNBC. He had watched those appearances at 6 a.m., with Lily asleep upstairs, eating toast, feeling nothing in particular about it. Not bitterness, not envy, nothing he'd have had to explain. Just the quiet observation that they were doing the thing they'd aimed at, and he was doing the thing he'd chosen instead. He climbed out of the truck, careful not to let the door thump. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who worked with their hands rather than a gym. The kind of build that wasn't cosmetic, that came from carrying things and lifting things and spending days in attics and crawl spaces and under vehicles. He wore clean dark jeans and a Henley under a canvas jacket. The jacket had a small paint streak on the left cuff that he'd missed when he'd checked himself in the bathroom mirror before leaving, and which he'd noticed at exit 22 and decided, by exit 23, was not worth turning around for. The event coordinator, a compact woman named Priya, who had emailed him 4 times in the last 24 hours with increasingly specific instructions about parking, access protocols, the name of the security guard who would clear him, and the precise location of the equipment staging area, met him at the service entrance with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she was already running behind. Mr. Webb. She looked him up and down in the way people do when they're confirming that reality has matched the story they'd already told themselves. The unit is in the main hall. Our tech team has been with it for 3 hours. We need it operational by 8. It was 6:47. I'll take a look, he said. She led him through a service corridor that smelled of cater-wrapped salmon and fresh-cut flowers, past a row of white-jacketed waitstaff polishing glasses with the practiced motions of people who had polished thousands of glasses and would polish thousands more, and through a set of double doors into the main hall. Marcus stopped. It was an extraordinary room. He'd seen photographs on the charity's website. The Ashford Children's Literacy Gala was the kind of event that got photographed well, but photographs hadn't communicated the scale of it. The ceiling was 30 feet, coffered in a pale stone that had probably been imported, with chandeliers that threw warm fractured light across a space arranged for 300 guests, round tables in ivory linen, centerpieces of pale autumn flowers, a stage at the far end with a podium and framing it, a pair of enormous display screens that would carry the evening's program to the back of the room. Somewhere near the kitchen, a string quartet was warming up, fragments of something Marcus almost recognized, reassembled and broken apart, assembled again. And at center stage, surrounded by a cluster of men in expensive casual clothing and expressions of escalating frustration, was the machine. He knew the machine. Not this specific unit, but the architecture, the bones of it, the lineage. It was an AS7 auto-present system, custom configured, the kind of thing that cost more than most people's houses and existed for a very specific purpose: to execute flawless, automated presentations at events where human error was considered unacceptable. It was a robotic arm assembly married to a 180-degree display array. Capable of dynamic physical object handling, it could lift, rotate, and present artifacts to an audience while the display synchronized around them, synchronized projection, and real-time audience tracking that could adjust its positioning based on where the speaker was standing and where attention was directed. The company that made them, Veriton Systems, out of San Jose, had exactly 6 engineers who fully understood the firmware architecture. Marcus had been the 7th, not with Veriton, but during his years at Holloway Aerospace, his team had been contracted to adapt the AS7 chassis for a defense presentation system, a classified application he couldn't discuss in detail, but whose technical requirements had demanded that he spend 11 months inside that machine's logic, studying its failure modes, mapping its thermal management system, documenting the vulnerabilities that Veriton's own engineers had cataloged internally and never published. He had read those internal notes in their entirety. He had then gone further, tested the failure modes himself, built a mitigation protocol, written a technical addendum that his team had submitted to the DoD, and which had, as far as he knew, been filed somewhere and never read by anyone who mattered. He had thought about that work, from time to time over the years that followed. Not with regret, more the way you think about a language you learned well and then stopped using, still there, intact, waiting. He crossed the hall quietly. The cluster of men around the stage didn't notice him at first. They were engaged in the particular kind of conversation that happens when technically capable people are panicking. Half sentences, blame shifted sideways through implication. Phrases like "the diagnostics show nothing," and "I've never seen it do this," and "we need to call the manufacturer." One of the younger men in the cluster was typing rapidly on a laptop, which Marcus recognized as the universal gesture of a person who needed to be visibly doing something regardless of whether that something was productive. Another was on the phone, speaking with the particular loudness of someone who wanted the room to understand he was on a call that mattered. "I understand that," the man on the phone was saying. "I understand your office is closed. I'm telling you that this is a priority situation and I need someone who can access the firmware documentation tonight." Is there? No. I'm not asking for the consumer support line. I need an engineer. I need someone who actually understands a pause. I'll hold. He held, standing slightly apart from the cluster, watching them with the flat patience of a man who had watched many expensive things fail and had learned to process that failure as simply another data point in a world that produced such data points reliably, was Graham Ashford. Marcus had seen him in photographs. He was 61, silver-haired, with the lean, deliberate build of someone who exercised because he was competitive by nature and had simply never stopped competing with himself, regardless of whether a competition was available. He wore a charcoal suit without a tie, and the particular ease of a man who had been the most important person in every room he'd entered for the last 20 years. Not arrogance, exactly. Arrogance requires some insecurity underneath it, some need to assert. What Ashford had was more like settled certainty. He had been right about enough important things, for long enough, that he had simply stopped expecting to be wrong. He was wrong sometimes. Everyone was. But he had learned to absorb that the same way he absorbed everything, efficiently, without drama, moving immediately to the question of what came next. Ashford looked at the machine. Then he looked at Marcus. "Who's this?" he said. Not to Marcus, to Priya, who had materialized at Marcus's elbow. "The technician we called," Priya said. "Marcus Webb. He's worked on automated systems before." Ashford studied him for a moment with those settled, considering eyes. His chief engineer, a heavy-set man named Dalton, whose jacket bore a Veriton Systems logo, and whose general bearing suggested a man who spent his professional life being the most technically authoritative person in any room he entered, turned from the cluster and did the same. Dalton took in the canvas jacket, the paint streak on the cuff, the toolbox Marcus was carrying. It was a standard toolbox, nothing remarkable about it. The kind of toolbox a handyman carried. "What are his credentials?" Dalton said. Also to Priya. As though Marcus were not standing 3 feet away and in full possession of both hearing and a working vocabulary. "He comes highly recommended," Priya said. "By whom?" "The Atlantic Events Guild. He's handled automation systems for several of their events. Complex ones." Dalton made a sound that was not quite a laugh, the compressed, nose-forward exhalation of a man who finds something mildly contemptible but is too professional to say so directly. "This isn't a rented projector at a wedding," he said. "This is an AS7 auto-present. Custom configuration. The build spec alone is proprietary. The firmware is under ENDA. There is no one outside of Veriton's engineering staff who is qualified to diagnose a fault at the firmware level, which is almost certainly where the fault exists, because I've already run a complete hardware check and there is no mechanical failure. Whatever is wrong with this system is—" "Can I look at it?" Marcus said. Dalton turned to him directly for the first time. He had the expression of a man who was about to explain something very carefully to someone who would not understand it, but who needed to be told anyway, so that later no one could say the explanation hadn't been given. "You can look at it," he said. "But I want to be transparent with you, so we don't waste each other's time. I have 3 senior engineers from Veriton, currently remote into the diagnostic interface. They cannot identify the fault. The unit is running a complete hardware check with no error flags. Whatever is wrong is not presenting in any of the standard fault channels. That means it's either firmware or a hardware fault too subtle for the onboard diagnostics to catch. And either way, there is nothing available to us tonight that can address it. I've already told Mr. Ashford." He looked at Ashford. Ashford nodded, once the slow nod of a man who has already made peace with an unpleasant truth and has moved on to the pragmatic question of how the evening proceeds around it. "Even the manufacturer can't fix it," Ashford said. The words landed in the room with the weight of a verdict. Not dramatic, just final. The announcement that a thing was in fact the way it was. Marcus set his toolbox down on the stage. "Mind if I take a look anyway?" he said. Nobody stopped him. That was the interesting thing about moments like this, when the official verdict had already been delivered. When the important people had already moved to acceptance, there was sometimes a strange permission that opened up in the space where urgency used to be. No one had the energy left to object to a handyman with a toolbox kneeling beside a $400,000 machine, because objecting would require re-engaging with hope. And hope had recently proven expensive. They had tried the reasonable things. They had called the manufacturer. They had run the diagnostics. They had done everything that the protocols said to do. And the protocols had failed. And now it was after 7 on a Friday night in coastal Maine with 300 guests arriving in less than an hour. And the event was what it was. So they watched. Dalton crossed his arms. Ashford stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. Priya retreated slightly toward the edge of the stage, as though positioning herself to be able to say, later, that she had believed in Marcus from the beginning, or alternatively, that she'd had nothing to do with any of this, depending on how things went. The younger engineer with the laptop looked up from his screen for the first time in several minutes. Marcus ignored all of them. He circled the unit once, slowly, without touching it. This was the part most people skipped. The looking part. The reading part. The part where you made yourself actually understand the situation before you imposed yourself on it. He had learned this from a man named Whitfield, his supervisor at Halloway, who had been 53 when Marcus was 26, and who had taught him more about engineering in 3 years than 4 years of MIT had managed. Whitfield's first principle was, before you touch anything, understand what it is trying to tell you. Machines talk. The language is physical. Heat, position, sound, weight, the way a thing holds itself in space. Most people don't learn to listen. Marcus listened. He was doing what he always did in the first minute with any unfamiliar system, reading it. Not the diagnostics, not the error logs. The physical reality of it, the way it sat in space, the way the robotic arm was holding position, not at rest exactly, but in a kind of constrained readiness, like a dog that had been told to stay but wasn't sure why. The display array was powered down. The status panel showed amber, not red. Amber meant caution, not failure. That was interesting. And then he saw it, or felt it rather, a small, almost imperceptible list to the left in the lower chassis assembly. Barely a degree. The kind of thing you'd miss if you were focused on the screen in front of you, which the Veriton engineers had been. Because they were doing what engineers do when they have remote access, they were staring at the data. They weren't looking at the object. There, he crouched beside the base panel and ran 2 fingers along the seam of the lower housing. The panel was warm. Not hot. The AS7 ran warm by design, part of the servo management architecture. A feature that had initially struck Marcus as odd until he'd understood the thermal reasoning, but this was a specific kind of warm. Differential. The left side was 3, maybe 4 degrees warmer than the right. He pressed his palm flat against the housing for 2 seconds, comparing left to right, and confirmed it. He knew exactly what had happened. The AS7 series had a thermal management system that relied on a sensor array in the base chassis to regulate servo temperature across the arm assembly. 6 sensors arranged in a ring formation around the thermal regulation module, each one calibrated to a tolerance of plus or minus half a degree. During the unit's transport, it had been trucked from a Boston warehouse to the estate that afternoon. He'd confirmed this with Priya during the walk through the service corridor. Noting it as potentially relevant information the way Whitfield had taught him to note things, the vibration profile of a long highway transit could, under specific conditions, cause one of the thermal management sensors to partially reseat. Not fully dislodged, not broken, not showing as damaged in any diagnostic, just shifted by perhaps 1.5 millimeters from its calibrated position. The diagnostics wouldn't catch it because the sensor was still registering. It was reading. It was transmitting a temperature value. It was just reading incorrectly, sending a false high-temperature signal to the servo management firmware, which was responding exactly as it had been designed to respond, by throttling the arm assembly's power output to prevent thermal damage to the servos. The machine was protecting itself from a fire that wasn't there. This was, in fact, a known failure mode. Not widely known, Veriton had never published it, because it reflected a design vulnerability they preferred not to advertise to their customers or their competitors. But it was documented in the internal technical notes from the Holloway Aerospace contract. which Marcus had read in their entirety during 11 months of work that felt, at the time, like simply doing his job carefully, and which turned out to be the kind of deep, specific technical knowledge that sits dormant in a person for years, occupying no space and asking nothing of you, and then arrives. One evening in coastal Maine, precisely when it is needed. He reached into the front pocket of his toolbox and took out his keychain. It was a modest thing. A house key with a Lego Batman keychain Lily had given him 2 Christmases ago and which he'd never taken off. A truck key. A small carabiner from a camping trip they'd taken in New Hampshire the summer before last. And attached to the carabiner, a Leatherman Micra that Elena had given him on their 3rd anniversary. She had bought it at a hardware store in Portland on a Sunday afternoon when they'd been walking, and he'd mentioned, offhandedly, that he was always misplacing his small tools, always starting a job and finding the screwdriver he needed was in a different drawer. She'd wrapped it in a piece of newspaper from the stack in the corner of the kitchen because she hadn't had time to find proper wrapping paper and hadn't wanted to wait to give it to him. She'd handed it to him that evening at dinner and said, "For a man who fixes things." He had been using it for 11 years. He unfolded the flathead driver. It was slightly narrower than optimal. The access panel screws on the AS7 base chassis were designed for a standard flathead, and the Micra's driver was a hair narrower than standard. He'd need to be careful not to slip. "What is he doing?" Dalton said, behind him. Not a question, not outrage. The kind of statement you make when you want the record to reflect that you had doubts, that you had said something, that the universe had been put on notice. Marcus didn't answer. He located the access panel, a 7-centimeter square recessed into the lower housing, secured by 2 Phillips screws. He looked at the screws for a moment, switched the Micra to its Phillips driver, which was nearly the right size, and began carefully, with light pressure, turning the first screw counterclockwise. Gentle, steady, not forcing it. The screw turned. The second screw turned. The panel came free. Inside was exactly what he'd expected. The thermal regulation module sat at the center of the base chassis, a black housing the size of a paperback book, with the sensor ring mounted on its forward face. 6 small cylindrical sensors, each about the diameter of a pencil eraser, arranged in the ring formation he'd seen in the technical drawings 15 years ago. 5 of them were seated correctly, their contact rings flush against the mounting surface. The left front sensor, the one closest to the arm assembly's primary servo housing, was off. Maybe a millimeter, maybe less. Less than the width of a fingernail. Enough, he pressed it, gently with the pad of his index finger. It seated. He felt it click, barely, the softest mechanical confirmation possible, the sound a thing makes when it returns to where it belongs. Not a dramatic sound, not a sound you'd hear from 10 feet away or remember later when you were describing the moment. The smallest sound in the room, in a room full of $300 worth of orchid centerpieces and a string quartet and a machine that cost $400,000. He held it there for a moment. Then he replaced the access panel, fitted the 2 screws back in, tightened them with the same light, careful pressure, slow clockwise, not over-tightening, respecting the threads. He put the Micra away. He stood up. He looked at the unit's status panel. For 1 second, nothing. Then the arm assembly initialized. The display array powered to standby with a sound like a slow breath. The unit ran its startup sequence, a slow, measured rotation of the arm through its full range of motion checking itself, a calibration sweep of the display array. The system confirming its own readiness with the unhurried methodicalness of a machine that had been designed to take its time getting things right. The status panel cycled from amber to white to a steady, solid green. The green confirmation indicator blinked 3 times, and then held. It took 2 minutes, maybe slightly less. The room was very quiet. Not the quiet of people holding their breath. The quiet that happens after people have been holding their breath and have collectively, Without discussion, let it out. Marcus picked up the access panel cover he'd temporarily set aside and slid it back into place. He folded the Micra back into its handle and clipped it to his keychain. He put his keychain back in his jacket pocket. He looked at Dalton. Dalton was staring at the machine. His arms had uncrossed at some point during the last 2 minutes. He was now standing with his hands at his sides, which gave him the appearance of a man who had forgotten, somewhere in the last 2 minutes, what he normally did with his hands. The expression of someone whose working model of a situation had been revised faster than their body language had caught up. That was a thermal sensor receipt, Marcus said, quietly. He wasn't explaining himself. He was providing information. The way you provide information when information is what the situation requires. The transport vibration profile can partially dislodge the left front sensor in the base chassis. It sends a false high-temperature reading to the servo management firmware. The arm throttles down as a heat protection response. The machine thinks it's about to overheat, so it reduces power to the servos. The diagnostics don't flag it, because the sensor is still registering, it's just misaligned by a fraction of a millimeter. It's reading wrong, not broken. He paused. Veriton knows about it. It's in their internal technical notes from the AS7 development cycle. They just haven't published it externally. He looked at Dalton. You'd want to add a vibration-resistant mount to that sensor before transport next time. It's a $15 part. Dalton opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He had the expression of a man standing in front of a fact that he didn't know what to do with yet. Not a man who was wrong, not a man who was angry, but a man who was encountering, with professional honesty, the specific feeling of being acknowledged. It was not a comfortable feeling. Marcus did not belabor it. Graham Ashford stepped forward. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who was accustomed to moving toward things, not away from them, toward problems, toward conversations, toward people he wanted to understand better. He stopped a few feet from Marcus. He looked at the machine, at the steady green light, at the arm assembly held in its ready position, at the display array glowing softly in the warm light of the main hall like something that had woken from a long sleep and found itself in a room it recognized. Then he looked at Marcus. "How did you know that?" he said. It was a fair question. Marcus had been asked versions of it before, over the years, not often, but occasionally, in moments when something he'd done hadn't matched the story people had constructed about him. The story was usually simple. A guy who fixed things. A handyman. A competent, reliable man with a truck and a toolbox and a list of clients who trusted him. Who showed up when something was broken and left when it was working. That was the story. It was, in the main, accurate. What it left out was the earlier story. The one that existed before Lily was born, before Elena got sick, before Marcus had looked, clearly and without sentimentality, at the trajectory of the life he'd been building. The promotions, the contracts. The aerospace conference circuit that took him to Stuttgart and Seoul, and twice to a facility outside of Houston where the work was classified, and the badge they gave him at the door was the kind of badge that still, occasionally, surfaced in his memory with a specific and useless clarity, and had decided, without drama, without crisis, that none of it was the thing he was actually going to do with the rest of his life. He had not, at the time, known exactly what that meant. He had simply known that Elena was pregnant, and that Elena's mother had died when Elena was 12, and that Elena had grown up in a house where her father had worked long hours and been largely absent in the way that dedicated men are sometimes absent even when they are physically present. She had not complained about this. She had processed it and integrated it and moved forward, the way Elena processed and integrated most things. But she had told him once, in the particular intimacy of 3 a.m, when they'd both been awake for no reason except that they were young and alive and didn't always need a reason, that she'd always hoped her own children would have something different. Not more material. Not safer, just more present. He had not forgotten that. So when the offer came from the division head at Holloway, the offer that would have required him to relocate to Houston for at least 2 years, with extensive travel, at a salary that was, even accounting for the cost of living adjustment, more than he'd ever made, he had said no, quietly, without extensive explanation, at a lunch meeting with a man who'd been very surprised. And then less surprised when Marcus had said, "We're having our first child." The man had nodded. He'd understood, or had said he understood, and Marcus had always given him the benefit of the doubt on that. He had left Holloway 6 months before Lily was born. He had spent the following years doing the thing that had always felt more like him than the career had, using his hands, using the knowledge his hands had accumulated, solving problems for people who needed them solved. He had built a reputation in the way you build a reputation when you are simply good at something and reliable about it, and honest with people, slowly, without marketing, through the particular alchemy of word of mouth. He had enough clients now that he could be selective. He was not wealthy. He was not struggling. He was by most measurable indicators exactly where he'd chosen to be. He told almost no one about the career he'd left. Not out of shame. There was no shame in it, as far as Marcus was concerned, not in any form he recognized as shame. But the world had a way of making a version of you that it was comfortable with, and once that version existed, it became a kind of social contract, unspoken but binding, and you were expected to maintain it, or to at least pretend you hadn't walked away from something the world considered valuable. People got uncomfortable when you didn't mourn the things they would have mourned. They read the absence of mourning as denial, or as performance, when really it was just the ordinary fact of a man who had made a clear-eyed choice and was living in it without regret. So he'd learned to be quiet about it. Not deceptive, just quiet. "I worked on this system," he told Ashford, "years ago. Different context, an aerospace application, government contract, but the same chassis, same firmware architecture. I spent about 11 months on it. I know its failure modes." Ashford was watching him with an expression Marcus couldn't quite categorize. Not surprise, exactly. The man was too composed for raw surprise, but something more like recalibration. The quiet adjustment of an internal model that had been operating on incomplete information and was now being updated. It was an expression Marcus had seen on smart people, and it was, in its way, the most respectful thing a smart person could do. "You're an aerospace engineer," Ashford said. "I was," Marcus said. "I don't do that anymore." "Why not?" Marcus considered the question. Around them, he could hear the soft sounds of the event staff beginning to move again, the crisis resolved, the paralysis lifting, the machine of the gala resuming its forward momentum. Priya was speaking in a low, quick voice into her earpiece, something about confirming the program timing with the AV team. The young engineer with the laptop had reopened it and was typing. 2 wait staff had appeared at the edge of the hall with a cart of champagne flutes, beginning the careful work of distributing them to the tables. Dalton had moved to the machine and was crouching beside the base chassis, examining the access panel with the careful attention of a man who was reading something he wished he'd read earlier. There was something almost touching about it. A good engineer confronting a gap in his knowledge, not with deflection, but with the straightforward desire to understand. "I have a daughter," Marcus said. "She needed a different schedule." Ashford nodded slowly. He didn't say what most people said, which was some version of that must have been hard, or I can only imagine what that sacrifice felt like, both of which presumed a grief that Marcus didn't have. Ashford simply nodded, the nod of a man who was taking new information seriously. "Where is she now?" he said. "In my truck," Marcus said. Ashford looked at him. "She fell asleep on the drive up," Marcus said. "She's fine. She's 8. She sleeps like she means it." Ashford almost smiled. "You brought her to a job." "I had her tonight," Marcus said. "Her grandmother usually takes her when I have an evening call, but she was in Bangor for a thing." Lily was excited about the drive. He paused. "She's been to stranger places." There was a moment, one of those moments that exist outside of the official timeline of an evening, in the space between what happened and the story people will tell about what happened, where the two men simply existed in the same room with each other. No performance, no negotiation. Ashford, who had built a company worth $4 billion from a thesis he'd written at 23, who had spent 40 years moving from one high-stakes situation to the next, and had become, in the process, the kind of man that other men in expensive suits deferred to. Marcus, who had carried a dead woman's Leatherman in his jacket pocket for 11 years, and had tonight used it to save a gala that the billionaire's own engineers couldn't fix. "I have 2 sons," Ashford said, after a moment. "Both adults now. Good men. The elder runs a division of the company. The younger chose law." He said this with a quiet, particular pride. The pride of a man who had built something and watched it outlast the building. "Then I missed a lot when they were young. I've thought about that." He said it simply, without self-pity or performance, without the coating of philosophical distance that people sometimes apply to admissions of regret to make them easier to make. Just a man accounting for a ledger that no one else could audit. It seemed necessary at the time. "It usually does," Marcus said. He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way you say a true thing that isn't a judgment. Ashford looked at the machine, at the green light, at the arm assembly patient, and ready in the soft glow of 300,000 watts of charitable goodwill. "I almost canceled tonight," he said, "when Dalton told me it was unfixable. I thought, it's one machine. The program can run without it. But the Literacy Foundation has been building toward this presentation for 8 months. The numbers they're going to show tonight, the outcomes data, the school partnership results, it matters that it lands the way it was designed to land. The machine is part of why it lands." He paused. "So I'm glad it's working." "So am I," Marcus said. Ashford looked at him then, really looked, with the full attention of a man who had learned, over 60 years of dealing with people, that full attention was worth paying. "What do I owe you?" he said. "Whatever Priya agreed to," Marcus said. "Hourly rate. It's on the invoice." Ashford almost smiled. "That's not what I meant." "Then you don't owe me anything," Marcus said. He said it without flourish. Not a noble declaration. Just the statement of a man who had done a thing that was straightforward and was reporting that fact accurately. He had fixed a machine. He had been hired to fix a machine. The transaction was complete. Ashford looked at him for another moment. Then he extended his hand. Marcus shook it. "Tell your daughter the gala raised money for children's books tonight," Ashford said, "because of her father." Marcus picked up his toolbox. "She'll like that," he said. He found Lily awake in the truck. She had climbed from the back seat to the front at some point during the hour and a half, and was sitting with her knees drawn up to her chest and her permission slip still in her hand, looking out through the windshield at the estate service lot with the particular expression she wore when she was working something through. A kind of focused blankness. The internal engine running audibly behind still features. She had her mother's face when she thought. The same quality of attention that turned inward. Marcus got in and started the engine to get the heat going. October in Maine was not forgiving after dark, and the truck had been sitting still for 90 minutes. "You were in there a long time," Lily said, not turning from the window. "About an hour," he said. "Hour and a half." "Did you fix it?" He glanced at her. "What makes you think it was broken?" "Because," she said, with 8-year-old certainty, "you always go to things that are broken. That's your job. You fix things." She turned from the window and looked at him directly, as she sometimes did when she wanted to make sure he understood she wasn't being rhetorical. "Was it broken?" He pulled the seatbelt across. "Yeah," he said. "It was broken." "Did you fix it?" "I did." "How?" He thought about how to explain it. He did this sometimes, translated the technical into the Lily-shaped, not because Lily couldn't handle complexity, but because the translation required him to understand what was actually essential about a thing, which was usually worth knowing. "There's a part inside the machine that measures temperature," he said. "Like a thermometer, but a tiny one, inside a computer. It was measuring wrong, it was saying the machine was too hot when it wasn't. So the machine thought it needed to slow down to protect itself. Like when your body gets a fever and you have to rest even if you feel fine. Lily considered this. Did you tell it the temperature was wrong? I moved the part a little bit, he said. Put it back where it was supposed to be. Then it measured right. How did you know to do that? I worked on the same kind of machine a long time ago, he said, before you were born. At your big job? He looked at her. She said it so naturally, his big job, as if there were no question that he'd had one. As if the fact of it were settled and normal. He had told her, over the years, pieces of it. Not because he wanted her to understand what he'd chosen or to explain himself. He had never felt the need to explain himself to his daughter, who had never asked him to. But because it was part of the story. And Lily liked stories that were true. And the truth of her father included years she hadn't been alive for, and a life that had been different before the life they shared. At my big job, he confirmed. She nodded, integrating this. Then, was the man nice? The man who owns the house? He thought about Ashford's hand in the dark. The direct quality of his attention. The way he'd said I missed a lot when they were young without asking for forgiveness or context. Just saying it. He was all right, Marcus said. He said to tell you the gala raised money for children's books because of your dad. Lily looked at him for a moment. Then she said, in the particular tone she used when she decided to accept a thing as true and good, that's nice. Yeah, he said. He put the truck in gear and pulled out of the service lot, the gravel crunching under his tires, that wealthy sound, the sound of money spent on small details, and onto the coast road, the ocean invisible but present on his left, making itself known in the way it always did at night, not visually. The weight of it. The smell. The sound underneath all other sounds, patient and enormous, entirely unconcerned with galas or machines or men with toolboxes or $4 billion companies, doing the thing it had been doing for 10,000 years before any of this, and would go on doing for 10,000 years after. They drove in silence for a while. The particular comfortable silence of two people who have spent enough time together that silence is simply another way of being together. Dad, Lily said eventually. What does the billionaire's house look like inside? He laughed. A real one. The kind that arrived without any orchestration. Like a lot of rooms you don't need, he said. She giggled. It was the best sound in the world. He had thought this since she was 6 weeks old, and had made a sound that he'd later understood was simply gas, but which had, in the moment, seemed like joy. And he had resolved then, in the particular irrational clarity of new fatherhood, that he would spend the rest of his life being responsible for as many instances of that sound as he could reasonably produce. He had not been perfect at it. No parent was perfect at it. But he had been present for it, which was, he had come to understand, the precondition for everything else. Was it pretty? She asked. The room they had set up for the event was, he said, very tall ceiling. Chandeliers, flowers on every table. He thought about it, like a movie version of a party. I like parties, she said. I know you do. You don't, she said. He considered this. I don't dislike them, he said carefully. I just don't need them. She accepted this with a small nod, the way she accepted most things he said about himself, not agreeing or disagreeing, just filing it as information about the specific and ongoing project of understanding her father, which she appeared to consider worth her time. He found this moving, in a way he didn't always have words for, that she paid attention to him, that he was, to her, interesting. Did you like it? She asked after a moment. The house? He thought about it honestly. He owed her honest answers to honest questions. The chandeliers and the coffered ceiling and the 14 acres of, someone's coastline, and the machine that cost more than his truck and his, tools and 6 months of his salary combined, and the cluster of men who had been unable to fix a thing that Marcus had fixed in 2 minutes with. A $12 tool on a keychain. It was impressive, he said. I didn't need it. Lily was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. Then she said, in the casual, certain way she said the things that turned out to matter most, I'm going to win the science fair. I know you are, Marcus said. How do you know? He kept his eyes on the road. The coast road was dark and winding, and entirely familiar. He had driven it hundreds of times now, in all seasons, coming home from jobs, and coming home from the grocery store, and coming home from the hospital twice when Lily had had strep, and once when she'd broken her wrist falling out of the tree in the backyard. It was, in the specific way of places you return to enough times, a road that had become his, not owned, just known. Because you're good at figuring out how things work, he said. You always have been, from when you were small. You used to take apart your toys to see the pieces. I broke them, she said. You learned what was inside them, he said. Same thing, at that age. She considered this. Did you do that too? I did, he said. I got in a lot of trouble for it. Did Grandma yell? Grandma yelled, he confirmed. She giggled again. He savored it. After a moment, she said, quietly, in the tone she used when she was saying something she'd been thinking about for a while, I learned how to figure out things from you. He didn't say anything. He drove. The road wound along the coast and the heat from the vents was warm and steady, and the night was dark on all sides, and Lily fell asleep again, the same as before, complete and unreserved, her head tipped against the window, and her permission slip still in her hand, her breath making little clouds that appeared and disappeared in the headlight-lit dark. Marcus drove. He thought about Ashford's sons, grown now, doing the things their father had built the scaffolding for, about the conference circuit he'd never finished climbing, about the corner office at Halloway that had been a year away, roughly, every year that he'd been there, receding at the same rate he approached it, as these things do. About the day he'd walked out of that building for the last time, a Tuesday, overcast, not remarkable, and had driven to the house where Elena was 7 months pregnant and sitting at the kitchen table doing the New York Times crossword, and she had looked up and said simply, You did it. And he had said, yeah. And she had gone back to the crossword, and he had made them both sandwiches. And that had been that. The micro was in his jacket pocket. 11 years. He had fixed a $400,000 machine tonight with a tool that had cost Elena $12 at a hardware store in Portland on a Sunday afternoon. This struck him, in the quiet of the car, as one of those perfect facts that didn't require interpretation. The kind of fact that just sat there, solid and self-contained and asking nothing of you except that you notice it. He noticed it. He thought about Whitfield, who had told him once that the most important thing you can know about a machine is what it's trying to do, not what it's failing to do. That the failure is always a symptom. The thing it's trying to do, that's the machine itself. Understand what it's for, and you understand everything. He had thought about that a lot over the years. Applied it to things that weren't machines. He drove home. The lights were on in the house when they arrived. He always left them on when he went out at night. A habit he'd developed when Lily was very small, maybe 2. And he'd had to run out briefly for something and had come back to find her awake in the dark at the top of the stairs calling for him, and had decided that a dark house wasn't something either of them needed to come home to. The porch light and the kitchen light and the light in the upstairs hallway, the one outside Lily's room. 3 lights, which was the right number. He had thought about this enough times to know it was the right number. He carried her inside. She was 8, and heavier than she used to be, and he carried her anyway. She made a small sound against his shoulder, but didn't wake. He carried her through the door he'd left unlocked, through the kitchen that still smelled faintly of the tomato soup he'd made for their early dinner, up the stairs that he'd replaced the 3rd step on 6 months ago because it had started to creak in a way that woke her at night, and into her room. Her room was entirely her own, a science project on the desk, the one she was going to win the fair with, a model of a water filtration system she'd built from hardware store parts, and a YouTube video, and 3 weeks of Saturday afternoons with Marcus at the kitchen table. Drawings on the wall, a horse, a house, a figure that was supposed to be a spaceship and looked more like a very fast bathtub. Books stacked on the bedside table because she always had 3 going at once and refused to choose. A stuffed rabbit on the pillow, the same one she'd had since she was 2, loved to near formlessness, missing one eye, beloved past the point of rationality. He laid her down. He pulled her blanket up to her chin. He stood there for a moment in the light from the hallway, just looking at her. In the morning she would wake up and want pancakes, and lose her left shoe, and find it under the couch cushion, same as always, and go to soccer practice and complain about the shin guards that were supposedly the right size but were uncomfortable, and come home and go back to work on the filtration system, and ask him 4 questions he knew the answer to, and 2 he'd have to look up. In 3 weeks she would stand in front of a gymnasium full of parents and teachers and judges and explain, clearly and without nervousness, how her water filtration system worked, and why it mattered, and what she'd learned from building it. She was going to win. He knew this with the same certainty he knew most things about her, not through calculation, but through the accumulated weight of 8 years of watching someone figure out the world in their own specific way, on their own specific terms, with a quality of directness and curiosity that was entirely their own, even when it mirrored his. She was her mother's daughter in 100 ways. She was his daughter in 100 others. She was, more than either of those things, entirely herself, which was the thing that made Marcus, some mornings, put down his coffee and simply stand for a moment in the kitchen, doing nothing in particular except registering that he had made the right choice. He turned off the hallway light. He went downstairs. He reheated the soup and sat at the kitchen table and ate it in the quiet of the house with the October dark outside the window and the sound of the wind off the coast moving through the trees. He thought about nothing in particular. He washed the bowl and dried it and put it in the cabinet. He checked the locks. He turned off the lights, all except the one in the upstairs hallway, which he left on. He went to bed. Tomorrow, Lily had soccer practice at 9. He'd set the calendar alert 3 weeks ago when she'd first made the team. He knew the route to the field and the name of her coach and which of her teammates she liked, and which one she'd had a falling out with last month that seemed to have resolved itself without his intervention, which was how he preferred these things to go. He knew these things because he had been there to know them. He lay in the dark and thought, briefly, about the machine in the main hall of Ashford Grand Estate, the arm assembly in its patient-ready position, the display array glowing, the green light steady. 300 people who would remember the evening as a success. The literacy foundation that would receive whatever the gala raised and would spend it on books and tutors and after-school programs and the long, unglamorous work of teaching children to read. A good outcome, by any measure. He thought about what Ashford had said. Tell your daughter the gala raised money for children's books because of her father. He had told her. She had said, "That's nice." That was, he thought, the right response. Not a performance of gratitude. Not an analysis of the significance. Just, that's nice. A thing that is what it is. A fact that fits into the world alongside the other facts, requiring no special treatment. He closed his eyes. He was, above all other things, a man who fixed things. He had fixed a marriage ceremony when the venue's sound system had failed with 40 minutes to spare. He had fixed a small restaurant's refrigeration unit on a Saturday night when every other repair service in the county was unavailable. He had fixed the plumbing in an elderly woman's house during a February cold snap because she'd called him at 7 in the morning and he had been awake anyway, and she had been cold. He had fixed, 3 times, the same temperamental furnace in the elementary school where Lily was now in 3rd grade. He had fixed, tonight, a machine that the manufacturer's own engineers could not diagnose remotely, using knowledge he had acquired 15 years ago while doing his job carefully, and a tool he carried in his jacket pocket that had been given to him by a woman he still loved. In the way you still love people who are no longer in the world, steadily, without grief being the main event, the love outlasting its occasion and becoming simply part of the fabric of a life. He had not, tonight, been remarkable. He had simply known a thing and done a thing. That was, when you stripped away the stage and the chandeliers and the billionaire and the Veritan engineers and the amber status light going green, all it had been. A man who knew something, arriving at a moment that needed it. He had spent 11 months learning about a machine. He had carried a tool for 11 years. Both of these things had converged, without planning, in a room he hadn't known about 6 weeks ago. He thought there was something in that, some truth about the way knowledge accumulates in a person, quiet and patient, going nowhere, asking nothing, simply waiting for its moment to be useful. The things you learn carefully, the tools you carry faithfully, the choices you make for reasons that don't always have names. Some of the most important things you never see coming. You just have to be the kind of person who's ready when they arrive. He woke at 6:15, which was when he always woke. He lay in the dark for a moment, doing what he always did, assembling the day. Tomorrow's weather was dry, which meant the roofing job in Harpswell could proceed. He had a boiler inspection at 2 o'clock for a commercial property in Brunswick. Lily's filtration system needed a new output valve because the one they'd used was leaking from the threads, and he needed to pick that up from the hardware store. Soccer at 9. He got up. The house in the early morning had a particular quality he'd grown attached to over the years. The specific stillness of a house with one person awake in it and one person still asleep. The way sounds carried differently in that hour. The way the light came through the kitchen window at this time of year at this angle and illuminated a strip of the floor in a way that only happened between October and February, and which Lily, when she was 5, had called the morning stripe, and which he had never been able to see without thinking about her saying that. He made coffee. He made oatmeal. He stood at the counter and ate the oatmeal and drank the coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard where the tree Lily had broken her wrist in still stood, entirely indifferent to the event, continuing to be a tree. He thought about the gala. Not with pride exactly. He was constitutionally unsuited to the kind of pride that required an audience, even an internal one. More the way you might review a workday. The job had been, fix the machine. He had fixed the machine. The job was done. The most interesting part, he thought, had not been the fixing itself. The fixing had taken 2 minutes and had been, once he'd recognized the failure mode, not complicated. The most interesting part had been the room. The way the room had felt before and after. The specific quality of silence that had followed the green light coming on, and what that silence had contained. The exhale of $300,000 worth of preparation not going to waste. The quiet recalibration of a man accustomed to being the most capable person in any room. Ashford had not, Marcus thought, been a bad man. He had been a man with a particular model of the world, and the model had a gap in it, a place where a canvas jacket and a paint streak on a cuff did not compute as expertise. Most models had gaps like that. You couldn't fault a person too harshly for having the model that the world had built for them, given what the world generally rewarded and what it generally ignored. The world rewarded, visibly and loudly, the kind of expertise that came in the right packaging. It was less attentive to the other kind. Ashford had updated his model. That was the thing that had made Marcus, walking back to the truck last night, feel something adjacent to respect for the man. He had updated his model without drama, without defense, without the conversational maneuver that most people made when they'd been wrong about something. The redirect, the context providing, the gentle repositioning. He just looked at the green light and done the arithmetic. Marcus respected that. He rinsed his bowl. He poured a second coffee and took it to the kitchen table, where Lily's filtration system was sitting in 3 sections. The intake housing, the filtration column, and the output assembly, waiting for the replacement valve. He looked at it the way he looked at most things, directly, without preconception, asking what it was trying to tell him. It was a good design, for an 8-year-old. Clean logic. Clear separation of functions. The intake housing had a mesh screen of her own fabrication. She'd cut it from a piece of window screen material and crimped it into a PVC coupling using a method she'd arrived at herself after 2 failed approaches. He had watched her work through the failures without intervening, which was, he believed, among the more important things he'd done as a father. Not solving problems for her. Being present while she solved them herself. The output valve was the only component that had given her trouble, and only because the threading on the PVC pipe was slightly irregular, a manufacturing defect, not a design error. He had identified this but hadn't told her, because he'd wanted to see how she diagnosed it. She had diagnosed it correctly within 20 minutes, measured the thread pitch against a spare fitting, noted the discrepancy, concluded it was the pipe and not the valve. "The pipe's wrong," she'd said, showing him the measurements. "What do you do about it?" He'd said. "Get a new pipe," she'd said. "Or get a valve with a different thread standard." A pause. "Or use thread tape. That would seal it." "Which of those is best?" he'd asked. She'd thought about it. "Thread tape," she'd said, "because it fixes the problem at the seal instead of changing all the other parts." He had agreed with her. She was going to win the science fair. He heard, at 6:40, the sound of her feet on the stairs, the particular sound, unhurried and patternless, of a child coming downstairs without urgency, but with purpose. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her soccer socks and pajama top, and the sweatpants she'd worn to bed, her hair in the specific configuration that meant she had slept on it wet and it had dried in an opinion. "Pancakes?" she said. "Pancakes," he confirmed. She sat at the table and looked at her filtration system. "I need the valve today," she said. "Hardware store opens at 8, he said. "We've got time before soccer." She picked up the output assembly and looked at it, turning it in her hands. "Do you think the judges will care that the valve's new?" she said. "Like, that I had to replace it?" He got the mixing bowl from the cabinet. "Why would they care?" "Because I changed a part." "Engineers replace components when components fail," he said. "That's not a design flaw. That's the job." He measured out the flour. "What would matter is if you changed the design because the design was wrong. You didn't. You changed a part because the part was defective." She considered this, turning the assembly in her hands. "That's what I said too," she said. "When I told Priya, her science partner, about it, she said it was cheating." "Priya's wrong," Marcus said. "I know," Lily said. "I told her." He looked at her. She was examining the threads on the output assembly with the focused attention of someone who had already solved a problem and was now simply confirming, for her own satisfaction, that the solution was correct. 8 years old. He made the pancakes. They ate together at the kitchen table with the morning stripe of October light across the floor. Lily talking about the science fair and about soccer practice and about a book she was reading in which a girl discovered a secret passage in her house, and he listened to all of it, not half listening, not doing the thing where you maintain a surface attentiveness while your actual attention is elsewhere. He listened the way he always listened to her, completely, because she was interesting, and because she was his daughter, and because he had decided, long ago, that this was not a thing he would let slip through the ordinary busyness of a day. After breakfast, she went upstairs to get dressed, and he cleared the table and looked out the window at the backyard and thought, briefly and without drama, about Elena. He thought about her most mornings, not with the weight that grief had carried in the early years, that had changed, was still changing, would probably continue to change in ways he couldn't anticipate. He thought about her now the way you think about someone who is part of you. Not separate, not absent. Part. She was in the kitchen, in the house, in the morning stripe, in the child currently thumping around upstairs looking for her cleats. She was in the micra in his jacket pocket, which he would wear today, as he wore it most days. She had wrapped it in newspaper. He had been using it for 11 years. He had fixed a machine last night that the manufacturer's engineers couldn't fix, with a tool she'd given him. And afterward, a billionaire had shaken his hand and thanked him. And none of that was a story he would tell anyone, because it wasn't a story he needed to tell. It had happened. It was real. It was part of the fabric of the day, same as the morning stripe and the oatmeal and the pancakes and Lily's hair and the hardware store opening at 8. Dad, from upstairs. Have you seen my left cleat? Check under the couch, he called back. A pause. Thumping, it's under the couch. I know, he said, to the kitchen, to the morning, to no one in particular. He dried his hands and got his jacket and put it on. And the micro was in his pocket where it always was. And outside the window, the Maine morning was cold and clear and entirely itself. They had things to do. He went to find his keys. He had not thought about Whitfield in a while. The drive back from the hardware store, Lily in the passenger seat with the replacement valve already out of its packaging and being examined for thread quality, the way she examined all new parts before using them, put him on the coast road, the same road he'd driven last night. And the light on the water in the morning was entirely different from the light at night. Not concealing, but clarifying. The kind of clear October light that showed everything exactly as it was. He had been 26 when he met Whitfield. He had been 26, 1 year out of MIT, hired by Holloway Aerospace as a junior systems engineer, with the kind of certainty that a good education and genuine ability and no particular personal disasters had given him. The certainty that he was building toward something, that each year was a rung on a ladder whose top he hadn't yet seen, but whose existence he did not question. He had been, looking back, very young in the way that people who have never been knocked down are young, even when they are technically adults. Whitfield was 53. He had come to Holloway by a route that Marcus had never fully understood. There were pieces of his biography that Whitfield mentioned in passing and never expanded on. Names of institutions and projects that suggested a career longer and stranger and more various than his current role implied. He had the title of Senior Systems Consultant, which was the kind of title that suggested either that you'd been promoted past the point of conventional categorization or that you'd opted out of the promotion track entirely. He had been Marcus's direct supervisor for 3 years. He had taught Marcus by example and occasional direct statement the things that Marcus considered most important to his work, that a machine is a theory of itself, and you understand it by understanding the theory, that most failures are not malfunctions, but implementations of the machine's design responding to conditions the design didn't anticipate, that the diagnostic is a conversation, not an interrogation, that the right amount of time to look before you touch is always longer than your first instinct suggests. The machine doesn't fail at you, Whitfield had said once, near the end of Marcus's second year, after a particularly frustrating week with a servo calibration problem that had resisted every conventional approach. They had been in the lab late eating sandwiches that Whitfield had produced from somewhere. The machine fails toward something. Find out what it's moving toward. That's where your answer is. Marcus had thought about this for a long time before he understood it. The AS7's thermal sensor wasn't failing. It was protecting. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, with incorrect information. The machine had been moving faithfully toward the objective of not burning out its servos. Find the bad information. Fix the bad information. The machine would do the rest. That was Whitfield's lesson. 15 years later. In a hall with chandeliers. Dad, Lily said, turning the valve fitting in her hands. Why do threads go clockwise? He thought about it. Because most people are right-handed, he said. Clockwise tightens when you turn with your dominant hand, but left-handed people would find it easier the other way. They adapt, he said. Same as with most things. She looked at the valve. That seems unfair. A lot of standards are, he said. Someone chose them before enough people were paying attention to make a different choice. She was quiet for a moment. Then, is that what a standard is? Just a choice that became so normal nobody questions it? More or less, he said. The good ones have reasons. The bad ones have inertia. She thought about this for the remaining 2 miles to the soccer field. He watched her think, in the peripheral way he'd developed for watching her while ostensibly doing something else. It was one of the things he loved most about her, this quality of engagement with questions. She didn't ask things to fill silence. She asked things because she wanted to know, and when she got an answer, she tested it, turned it, held it up to the light. Elena had been like that. He had fallen in love with Elena partially because of the way she asked questions, the directness of her curiosity, the absence of performance in it. She had asked him, on their second date, why he'd chosen aerospace, and he'd given her the standard answer. He found the intersection of physics and engineering compelling. He'd always been interested in flight systems. His undergraduate thesis had been on structural resonance in composite airframes, and she had listened to all of it and then said, "That's what you do. Why do you like it?" He had not, before that moment, been asked to distinguish between those two things. He had thought about it for a moment, honestly, and had said, because when a system works, it works completely. There's no approximation. The bridge holds or it doesn't. The structure resonates or it doesn't. You have to be exactly right. She had looked at him with the expression that he would later understand as the expression that meant she was deciding something. "That's the answer," she'd said. The first one was the resume. He had known by the end of that evening that he was going to be with her for the rest of his life. He had been with her for 11 years. She had been gone for 6. The math of that was still strange to him sometimes, that the absence had now lasted longer than the presence, at least in terms of the years he was counting, even though the presence was still so much more of him than the absence. He had not expected that. He had not known, when she died, that love was not something that depleted, that it was more like a geological feature, formed by events, shaped by time, but not eroding, present in the landscape regardless of whether the forming event still occurred. The soccer field parking lot was full of the specific organized chaos of Saturday morning youth sports, folding chairs being unloaded from trunks, children in cleats testing the ground, parents in varying states of coffee readiness, exchanging the particular brand of social pleasantry that belongs to people who didn't choose to know each other but have been made neighbors by their children's scheduling, and who have developed, through necessity, a genuine warmth that neither party could have predicted. He parked. He and Lily got out. She ran immediately toward the field, and her teammates, the valve forgotten in the cup holder, the scientific project temporarily suspended in favor of the present moment, which was also entirely correct. He got his folding chair from the back of the truck and set it up at the edge of the field. A woman named Trish, whose son played defense, set up her chair 2 spots down. They had spoken at enough of these practices to have moved from stranger courtesy to the genuine, particular friendship of people who share a small, ongoing context. She was a nurse. She had an opinion about the referee at last week's game that she had expressed with surgical precision and he had largely agreed with. "How was last night?" she asked. She knew he'd had an evening job. "Good," he said. "Fixed a machine at a gala." "What kind of machine?" "Automated presentation system. It was the centerpiece of the event. Wasn't working." "But you fixed it," she said. "Not a question." "I fixed it," he said. "Of course you did," she said, in the tone of someone for whom this outcome had never been in doubt. He watched Lily on the field. She was talking to her teammate Priya, the science partner who had said replacing the valve was cheating, the same Priya. And from the gestures he could see that they were either discussing the filtration system or last week's game or both. It was hard to tell. They were reconciled, evidently children reconciled faster than adults, which was one of the things children got right. On the field, the coach called them to attention. Lily turned immediately, snapped to it the way she snapped to things she cared about, which was a quality that had been present in her since before she could reliably walk, and which Marcus had always known better than to try to manufacture or redirect. You did not manufacture that quality. You either cultivated it or you got out of its way, and both were, in their context, the right thing to do. He settled back in his chair. The Maine morning was cold and clarifying, and the grass was still damp, and somewhere down the coast, he knew, the Ashford Grand Estate was winding down from last night, staff clearing tables, florists reclaiming their arrangements. Dalton probably on a call with Veriton's engineers, explaining the failure mode to people who had known about it and hadn't published it. The machine was in its transport case, presumably arm assembly locked. Display array folded. The thermal sensors resting in the positions where they belonged, held there not by Marcus, but by the corrected physics of the system, which no longer needed his finger. He had been in that building for 90 minutes. He would probably never be in it again. That was fine. He watched his daughter run. The gala, as Marcus learned a week later, raised $432,000 for the Literacy Foundation. He learned this because Priya, the event coordinator, not the science partner, sent him an email with the subject line "Thank you" and the body of the email containing the exact figure and a sentence that said, "The program ran without a single technical issue, largely thanks to you." She also included a note that Mr. Ashford had asked her to pass along. The note from Ashford was 5 sentences. The first 4 expressed appreciation in the direct, unadorned way of a man who was not accustomed to expressing appreciation and was doing it anyway because he had decided it was the right thing to do. The 5th sentence said, "My foundation is funding a children's engineering camp next summer in partnership with 2 Maine school districts. If your daughter would like a spot, I would like to offer her one as my personal guest." Marcus read this at the kitchen table with his second coffee on a Tuesday morning while Lily was at school. He sat with it for a while. Then he replied, thanking Ashford for the note and the offer, and saying that he would ask Lily and let him know. He considered the sentence for a moment, whether it was the right amount of warmth, whether it communicated the thing he wanted it to communicate, which was, "I'm not moved by the prestige of this offer, and I'm not dismissive of the generosity behind it. I'm a father asking his daughter if she wants to go to an engineering camp." He decided the sentence was right and sent the email. That evening at dinner, he told Lily about the camp. She put down her fork and looked at him. "An engineering camp," she said. "Building things," he said. "Circuits, robotics, basic programming. 2 weeks in July." She looked at her plate. "Then, with other kids?" "With other kids. Kids who like to figure out how things work?" "That's the idea," he said. She picked up her fork again. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" He said. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." She ate a bite of pasta. Then, "Did you tell the billionaire about the thermometer thing I figured out?" "The thread pitch," he said. "Yeah," she said. "The thread pitch. On the valve." "I didn't," he said. "But I could." She considered this. "You don't have to," she said. "I just wondered." He watched her eat. She had the quality of a person who understood, in a way she hadn't been taught explicitly, but had absorbed through some combination of observation and temperament, that most things worth knowing were accumulated rather than delivered, that you got good at things by doing them until you were good at them, and that the doing was most of it, and the people who tried to skip the doing and go straight to the being good were missing the part that mattered. He had never told her this explicitly, either, but she knew it. He was, he thought, not entirely sure where she'd gotten it, and not entirely sure it mattered. Some things were inherited. Some were chosen. Most were some third category that resisted clean labeling. He finished his pasta. Later, after Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the micra in his hand, not using it for anything, just holding it. He did this occasionally, not as a ritual, not deliberately, just found himself with it in his hand. Elena had bought it on a Sunday in Portland, at a hardware store they'd walked past on the way to somewhere else, and she'd seen it in the window and thought of him. And that chain of events was complete and closed now, and would always be exactly what it was. He had fixed a machine with it. He would probably fix other things with it. He put it in his jacket pocket. He went to bed. Before Marcus left the stage, Dalton had come to him. He came without his arms crossed, which was different from before. He came with the particular bearing of a man who had something to say and was calculating the exact right way to say it. Not defensively, not aggressively, but with the careful precision of a good engineer who had been given new data and was trying to properly integrate it. The left front sensor, Dalton said. You said it's in their internal technical notes. It is, Marcus said. I've been through most of the AS7 documentation. I've never seen it. It's not in the published documentation, Marcus said. It was in the technical notes from a third-party contract. A government application. The documentation was classified when I worked with it. He paused. I don't know what its current status is. Dalton processed this. So you can't tell me where to find it? No, Marcus said. But you've seen it now, the failure mode and the fix. You could write it up yourself. Dalton looked at the base panel. I should have found this, he said. It was not a self-flagellation, it was an accounting. The specific quality of a professional saying, this was in my area of responsibility and I missed it. You were looking in the right places, Marcus said. The sensor was still registering. Diagnostics would never have caught it. You'd have needed to know the failure mode existed in order to look for it physically. Dalton nodded slowly. I'd add the vibration-resistant mount to the spec for transport, Marcus said. Velcro-backed thermal pad behind the sensor ring. $15 of material, 3 minutes of installation. Prevents this entirely. Dalton took out his phone and made a note. Who did you work for? He said, not looking up from the phone. Holloway Aerospace, Marcus said. I left about 8 years ago. Dalton looked up. He did not say, what are you doing fixing machines at charity galas then? He did not say, why aren't you still doing this at the level where this kind of knowledge gets used? He was an engineer, and he had too much respect for the complexity of a person's circumstances to presume that he understood why any individual had arrived at the place where they currently stood. It was good work, Dalton said instead. Recognizing it. Thank you, Marcus said. He meant it. It was, in its way, the professional recognition that the moment warranted. Not from Ashford, not from Priya, not from the room. From the engineer who had been in the room long enough to understand what had actually happened, and who had said so directly. That was worth something. He picked up his toolbox and went to find his daughter.